Since the discoveries of molecular biology in the 1950s, the idea of mutation and natural selection as the engines of evolution are utterly indefensible from a scientific standpoint. The simple reason is the stupendous complexity of all living systems. This is confirmed by these tiny molecular machines with amazing abilities seen in every form of life. Coming up on today's edition of Origins, Darwinism Doesn't Work, Part 1 with Dr. John Baumgardner. Hello and welcome to Origins. I'm Ray Heiple. It's an honor to be your host today. During this program, we showcase interesting guests who present evidence from science, along with other important facts, validating the truth of creation and the accuracy of the Bible. Today's guest, Dr. John Baumgardner, is Research Professor Emeritus in the School of Engineering at Liberty University. He has a PhD in geophysics from UCLA and worked at Los Alamos National Laboratory in computational physics during most of his scientific career. Since the early 1980s, he has provided most of the primary research on the concept of catastrophic plate tectonics in connection with Noah's flood. And he helped develop software modeling mutation and natural selection. Welcome to the program, John.
Thank you very much, Ray. It's my pleasure.
Well, we have the program that we're looking at today is Darwinism Doesn't Work. Can you tell me, what do we mean by that?
What we mean is that Darwin, as a scientific theory, simply does not deliver what most people have been taught that it is supposed to deliver.
Okay, so what Darwinism is saying that it can explain, we're saying it doesn't explain that at all.
That's right.
Well, how can we prove that?
So as well as we look at the various kinds of plants and animals around us, for example, this parrot, or this fawn, or this lion cub, it's natural for us to ask, how did these wonders arise? Well, the answer we get overwhelmingly in our culture is by evolution. But surprisingly, the evolutionary theory of today hasn't changed from 75 years ago. It's still nearly identical to the framework referred to as the modern synthesis that was proposed by a few key scientists and accepted in the early 1940s.
So the modern synthesis then takes Darwin's original ideas along with the ideas of a few others, right? And that's where we're still basing things on.
That's right. That's right. It was called that, the modern synthesis, because it was a synthesis or merging of the three following elements. It had the idea of natural selection offered up by Charles Darwin. Basically, another description is survival of the fittest, that the most fit organisms tend to leave more offspring than the others, and therefore, after several generations, the population reflects those characteristics that enable the organism to be more fit to its environment.
So an animal in its environment, all the different factors working on it, working against it, the strongest survive and they pass on their offspring.
That's right.
Okay.
And actually there's nothing really wrong with that. Mm-hmm. It's just that it doesn't go very far. It can't explain novelty. It can't explain new features. Mm. The second element was the laws of genetic or gene inheritance discovered by Gregor Mendel, who was an Austrian monk in Austria, who discovered this in the mid-1860s. In other words, he was a contemporary of Darwin, but Darwin knew nothing of his work.
And so this gene inheritance, what is that?
Well, basically, Darwin basically believed in sort of a blending kind of inheritance, that the traits of each parent sort of blended together in some way. But Mendel discovered that inheritance is by discrete units. He worked with pea plants and found out that various traits in the pea plants were inherited discretely, like the color of the seeds, whether they were yellow or green, the color of the flowers. And he discovered that there are specific individual traits that are passed down according to certain mathematical laws. And so it added a lot of understanding to how inheritance works. The third element here is the idea of random mutation. This wasn't discovered until 50 years after Darwin published Origin of Species. It was discovered by Thomas Hunt Morgan in experiments with fruit flies at Columbia University. He first identified it in 1910. It's important because Darwin did not have any source for genetic novelty, any kind of source for new traits. And that became a problem for his theory in the latter part of the 1800s.
Sure, you can see that, because if the parent's going to be like the child, but if there's nothing that's going to move the child further on, right, or add something new, and that's where this comes in,
right.
It seems. Okay.
Right. This theory, grounded in these three simple principles, purported to explain how all living things arose by purely natural processes with no input from an intelligent creator.
So broadly speaking, we have natural selection, we have gene inheritance, and then we have random mutation, and that explains everything.
That's right.
Wow.
Plus a lot of time. That's a fourth element. It's very. So in place of intelligence, this theory, now known as neo-Darwinism, relies on random trial and error changes or mutations to the genes, and the individuals that carry these genes are acted upon by natural selection. And then over vast spans of time, the process supposedly leads to new and more advanced forms of life. Yet the basic theory we have today is essentially, there's nothing new been added since the 1940s,
okay.
75 years ago. However, in light of discoveries in molecular biology since the 1940s, that theory has become utterly indefensible from a scientific standpoint. So I would like to talk about some of these.
Good. I want to hear this.
There are many reasons why this is so, but a huge one is that life has a crucial non-material component. Now, what do I mean by non-material? Well, it does not involve anything associated with matter. No electrons, protons, neutrons. It has no mass or weight. And we're talking about the software that underlies living systems. And this non-material component is, because it's non-material, is inexplainable in terms of material processes. So Darwinism is a material process. So it absolutely has no ability to deal with this non-material aspect of living systems. But before we get into that, I want to first take a glimpse of what life is like at the molecular level, so we have an appreciation with just what we're trying to explain. We now know that life relies on an astonishing array of miniature machines, each typically consisting of only a few protein molecules. These machines are so small in size that effectively every atom makes a difference. And I want to look at two examples here. This is an animation of a small robot that we have thousands of copies of in our cells. It's called kinesin, and it's only the part with the feet here. The circle represents the container that this robot is carrying, and it's walking down one of the structural elements in the cell called a microtubule. There are thousands of these microtubules in the cell. But this is an example of some of the many moving parts that exist in every one of our cells. This is another depiction of that biped motor protein, kinesin, and the big transport vesicle that it's carrying around.
So this is every cell has this sort of thing happening, thousands of them.
Thousands of little robots. And
Wow.
this is just one of thousands of different kinds of machines that the cell has. And this slide shows the network of microtubules. In this case, it's in a monkey liver cells. And the microtubules are stained red and the cell nucleus blue in this slide.
So that graphic we looked at before where the robot was walking on one of those microtubules, there's quite a few of them here.
That's right, that's right. You can understand how there could easily be thousands.
A lot of robots, a lot of these tubes, okay.
A lot of things happening, very dynamic processes unfolding every second, every moment in our cells. I want to look at another type of machine. It has a rather long name. It's called ATP synthase. It's a rotary machine that its purpose is to re-energize the little energy molecules that all these other machines need to power them.
Now, is this in every cell also,
Every
John?
cell of every kind of organism, from bacteria to plants to humans. And I want to talk a little bit about this ATP molecule that provides the energy. This is what it looks like. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphates because it has these 3 phosphate units. And to yield up to give off its energy, one of these phosphate units becomes detached. And that's what empowers our muscle cells. All these robots, the Kinesin robot, every step it takes, it uses one of these molecules for energy. And if one of the machine needs the energy, it just grabs one nearby. Once it has given up its energy, that phosphate unit needs to be reattached so that it can be used again.
Sort of like the truck that drops off the groceries, goes back and picks up more, right? Basically, this has to go back and
it needs to be recycled. So this machine, this rotary machine, does that, accomplishes that. It takes adenosine diphosphate, mechanically adds the phosphate unit back and turns it into new ATP that can be used again.
like a recycling machine.
It's a recycling machine. And there can be hundreds of thousands of these rotary machines in each of our cells. Especially like our heart muscle cells need lots of energy. There's typically that many in a heart muscle cell.
Hundreds of thousands in
Yeah.
a single cell.
In a single
We're talking
cell.
Very, very small, obviously.
And just to give you an idea of how important this process is, we have about 1.5 ounces of ATP in our bodies, but that gets recycled about once a minute. So the total amount of ATP recycled in our bodies every day is approximately equal to our body weight. So if you weigh 150 pounds, you have roughly 150 pounds worth of ATP recycled in your body every day.
You don't live without this, correct?
Right. You do not live. In fact, one of the reasons for aging is that the machinery starts to get worn out. And we don't recycle it as efficiently when we get like 70, 80, 90 years old. So that's one reason we don't have the energy we had.
ATP starts breaking down, as it were.
Yeah. Where do these little machines live in the cell? Well, they're inside an organelle, a little kidney bean-shaped organelle. We can have hundreds of these in our cells, and they're attached to a membrane inside what is called a mitochondrion. The gold dots here represent the ATP synthase machines.
So every one of those gold dots is another one of those machines carrying energy that detach, then have to be recycled.
Right.
Wow.
And this is an electrically driven machine, a rotary machine driven by a flow of protons through it. All right, this shows each color represents a different kind of protein. You see the complexity of the machine. There are about 40,000 atoms that are in this machine. 31 different proteins have to come together to make one of these machines.
And again, I know I'm saying it, but every cell has thousands of these.
That's right. And this is an animation showing showing it rotating, showing the ADP and phosphate coming in, and these little lavender molecules coming out. That's the re-energized ATP. So it spins about 10,000 RPM, and incredible complexity machinery here.
And that we're watching that whole recycling happening there in the graphic animation.
And this bottom part is catalytic. So it enables this process to happen much faster than it would if the structure was not there to catalyze the reaction. And again, I emphasize it's in every living thing, from bacteria to people. So in the evolutionary scenario, this would have to be in the very first cell, this kind of complexity.
Wow.
So I again emphasize that all these machines in the body, almost all of them, use ATP as their energy source. In addition, all of these machines we're seeing here have to be manufactured within the cell itself. There's a special machine in the cell that fabricates all these other machines. It's called a ribosome. And the ribosome gets its instructions on how to build each protein from information that's encoded in the organism's DNA. And this is a very crude representation of the ribosome. It's this bottom part right here. This is a strand of what's called messenger RNA, which is copied a very brief piece of the information in the DNA. The piece needed to construct one protein. And then in the environment, there are what are called transfer RNAs that are connected to an amino acid. And this machine, what it does is it allows just the right transfer RNA to mate up to match the tape that's running through it and create this growing protein chain. Amino acids linked together like Legos. In the human body, something like 100,000 different types of protein are made. So this gives you some idea of more of the complexity in a cell, what's been discovered since the 1950s as to how the cell works at the molecular level.
It really boggles the mind that anything like this could be even remotely produced by man, let alone how can we explain this?
Yeah, this is so far beyond any human technology, especially the miniature scale of it all.
John, I'm going to have to stop you right there. We need to take a break. This is really fascinating stuff. Let's continue right after this. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Scientific materialism, the belief that life is nothing more than the product of blind, undirected processes. Why has our world chosen to push a pseudoscience that is neither fact-based nor provable, but instead is a narrative simply designed to push their own agenda? It is time to embark on an amazing journey as we delve into several facets of science: paleontology, geology, astronomy, microbiology, genomics, and more. Each one of these areas confirming the work of our Creator. We're inviting you to come along with us in this unique presentation, The Miracle of Creation, for your gift of only $20. From Dr. Danny Faulkner and the wonders of our universe, to Dr. Marcus Ross and the discovery of soft tissue inside dinosaur bones, you will be captivated, entertained, and astounded as the true facts of science ring out, pointing to its author as the creator of all. To get your copy, write to Origins, Cornerstone Network, 1 Signal Hill Drive, Wall, PA 15148, or call 412-824-3930. Get your DVD today for only $20 and find out how God has made himself known for all who are willing to see.
Welcome back to Origins. We're talking to Dr. John Baumgardner, who's been sharing about the complexity that is in every single one of our cells as we look at the show Darwinism Doesn't Work, Part 1. John, we left off looking at how the RNA is able to string together these proteins. Can you describe for us in a little more detail the importance and significance of that?
Right. Well, this slide summarizes what I was speaking of just before the break. And I was talking about the information that specifies each protein is encoded in the DNA. And there's the DNA opens up a little, the right part of it opens up so that a copy can be made, an RNA copy. And the steps of forming the RNA, messenger RNA copy, and feeding it through the ribosome is sort of abbreviated in these dashed arrows here. So the point is that the information in the DNA is used to fabricate these proteins. For most machines, they involve more than one protein. After they're manufactured, they get assembled together into the molecular machine.
So each one of those masses there on the bottom, different colors, the blue, the red, the green, those are different proteins,
Different
correct?
proteins.
And then they're put together to form another structure.
To form the machine, like the kinesin robot.
Okay.
Or the very complex machine, the ATP synthase.
And this is overseen then, as you said, encoded. The DNA, in a sense, has the instructions.
That's right.
To do this.
Exactly.
And so that everything going through that ribosome, it knows what to do now.
It just follows the specifications carried in that strip of messenger RNA.
So this is a directed process, as far
Yes.
as we can tell. This is something that's happening because something is telling it to occur.
And we really don't understand the communication that goes on. Those things are still very big research topics to try to understand how all this gets communicated at a higher level in the cell. So it ought to be obvious to any thinking person that such complex nanoscale machinery absolutely demands a designer. It's simply irrational to conclude that such complexity could possibly arise as a result of a random trial and error search process. There have not been enough individual organisms in the history of life on Earth to test all the possible configurations of even one life protein.
Now, what does that mean, John, when you say a single life protein?
Well, let's just take one of the proteins in kinesin. In order to test all the configurations to find just the one that is needed to work, hasn't been enough organisms. Today, in our world today, there's something like 1,000 billion bacteria that live and die each year. Had that been going on for 1 billion years, it still is just almost nothing compared to the number of possible configurations of these protein molecules.
And that's in a single one of these robots, the kinesin.
Yeah, just one protein, or one of the 31 proteins in ATP synthase. There's no way to test all the possible configurations of that protein.
All of the living things in all of time, even if the evolutionists are right and there's been 4 or 5 or 10 billion years, we're still saying that you couldn't even begin.
You couldn't even
to
begin to explore the possibilities. So this idea of a random process is scientific absurdity, utter absurdity. A person shouldn't even call himself a scientist if he advocates this idea.
You know, John, what I love about your work is that you just come out and say it like it is. It is simply irrational to conclude that this complexity could possibly arise as a result of random trial and error search process. You know, we have a lot of folks who will say, well, you know, you can start with creation and it makes sense, or you can start with, you know, evolution and randomness and it makes sense. And you're saying, no, it doesn't make sense over here. We're not talking about two different systems that can work. We're talking about a system that can't work.
No, that explanation simply is not viable. It's irrational from what we know about what life is like at the molecular level.
So if we're going to live our lives as we do as rational human beings and make judgments and make sound conclusions, evolution, neo-Darwinism is unsound.
Untenable. Given the reality of what life is like at the molecular level, there's not a scientist on Earth today who can successfully defend the neo-Darwinian hypothesis.
Now you're aware, obviously they try to, but you're saying that it doesn't work.
If confronted with these issues that I'm talking about, they have no answer. They have no rational explanation.
Their elements, again, of natural selection, random mutation, genetic inheritance just can't explain it.
Doesn't deliver.
No matter how much time you have.
That's right. That's right. So in the next segment, we shall show further that the DNA specifications are linguistic in essence and non-material and could never arise by any sort of process involving matter alone.
So this was Darwinism Doesn't Work Part 1, and you're going to come back and we're going to do Darwinism Doesn't Work Part 2.
That's right.
Well, thanks for being on the program, John.
You're most welcome.
I look forward to your visiting us again and following up on this subject. And thank you for being with us. As we looked at the complexity of a cell today, we examined it in the light of what's been called neo-Darwinism, which has the elements of natural selection, random mutation, and genetic inheritance. And with those three principles, neo-Darwinism says it can explain all of life. But when we look at just the complexity of a single cell, we saw that it's not only improbable, but it's rationally absurd to conclude that. Well, it just goes to show one more time that we know what the Bible says is true, and the proof is all around you, even in the tiniest living things. If you enjoy Origins, we could sure use your help to help keep this creation television program on the air. It takes a lot of people, a lot of time, a lot of equipment, and a lot of money to make these programs. Won't you consider prayerfully and financially supporting us so that we can continue to work together and reveal how our awesome Creator is doing and active in this world? And we'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching this edition of Origins. For a DVD of this program, you can order online or send a $12 donation to cover shipping and handling and write to Origins, program number 2111, Cornerstone Network, Wall, Pennsylvania 15148.
This presentation was made possible by the faithful prayers and financial support of you, our Cornerstone family.